Good morning, everybody. Happy Valentine's Day. I appreciate you all coming at 8:30 in the morning. I joke that one of the other reasons that we scheduled this in the morning is so that we can all get home to our spouses in time for Valentine's Day, deliver flowers and go to dinner. I'm excited to be here today at the American Enterprise Institute with my colleagues here to talk about cell and gene therapy. And just, sort of going back in time, I remember when I was in medical school about 15 years ago, and I heard about cell and gene therapy. It was this random sort of experimental idea that had been tried in the 90s and didn't work very well. And now here today, we have products on the market that can actually cure disease, are safe and effective, and can transform people's lives. I was thinking about someone I know who had retinitis pigmentosa who passed away about a year or so ago from lymphoma. And then now there's the potential for them to actually, someone like them, to undergo treatment and not lose their vision. We also now have a new therapy for sickle cell disease, a disease that is debilitating to untold thousands of Americans who suffer from pain and complications. So today we're going to talk about payment policy issues, FDA regulatory policy issues. We're very lucky to have a very smart crowd here with us. Representative Guthrie, who's a leader in thinking about innovation and ensuring access to innovative therapies for all Americans. He's the chair of the Energy and Commerce Health Subcommittee. My friend Sheila Michael, who is a serial entrepreneur. She has been in the gene therapy product development space 23 years?
Almost 25, yes.
Almost 25 years. So she's been through it when it was very, very hard. And
It's still hard.
it's still hard. Yeah, succeeded against the naysayers. She has built multiple companies, sold 3 of them. The last one she sold to Bayer 2 years ago for $4 billion. We also have Peter Marks. Dr. Marks has had a phenomenal career across academia, industry, and the FDA. So he understands these issues all from the perspective of someone who has literally been in every chair, which is very atypical and highly valuable. So he's the director of the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research at the FDA. And then at the end, we have Eric Paulson, who is the chair of the Institute for Gene Therapies. He was a representative from Minnesota, served on the Ways and Means Committee, and was the co-chair of the MedTech Caucus. So we are lucky to have everybody here today, and I thought that we would start with some introductory remarks from each of our panelists.
So thanks everybody for being here today, and thanks for having me. So I'm Brett Guthrie, chair of the Health Subcommittee for Energy and Commerce, and kind of my interest in this, matter of fact, I have a military and a manufacturing background in automotive supply parts, so why in the world am I chairing the healthcare subcommittees? Most people, when they come to Congress, the House is, and Eric can tell you, is absolutely a snapshot of America, so most people kind of get into areas where they have expertise, where they brought to the table from their background. And I had served in state government and in the state senate and then came here, and Medicaid policy was really important to me because that was going to make or break the Kentucky state budget. We have to balance our budget. And so I really wanted to be on energy and commerce, really kind of from the payer side. How do you pay for these drugs without bankrupting states and governments? And as I got on and once you get on these committees, people start showing up that have different products and different groups of like the things that you're doing, and just became fascinated with the movement and innovation and what's happening. I have a friend whose son has sickle cell. You see I had a friend who, 2 friends who've lost their children to cystic fibrosis in their mid-20s. And now I understand if you have the certain type of gene, there's not all of them, but that people can live to be in their 70s that have cystic fibrosis. And so think if you can cure somebody with sickle cell, what it does for their life, the most important, but what it does for the family, and then what it does for budgets. But the issue is you're talking about, as we're going to talk about today, as you're talking about if and I'm not dismissing the value to the human being, but if you're looking at just from the payer side of it, you're looking at payments year after year after year of someone that have these diseases or these genetic issues, whereas the fix or the cure can be upfront money. And so how do we manage that and how do we deal with that? And that's something that's been my driver with Mark Wayne Mullen, who's now in the Senate. And so those are the issues, but the innovation in healthcare. And so the question is, we have $1 trillion budget deficit, we have $34 trillion of debt. How do we sustain this at the same time make it sustainable for our taxpayers?
Thank you. Sheila?
Yeah, I just like to build on a few comments following Congressman Guthrie and some of the points that he made. I think the future of healthcare is really bright. I mean, today we have technological advances that allow us to basically correct genetic defects. Fix it, right? Rather than treating the symptomology. I have a chronic disease, and today I have to take a pill every day, right? And eventually I'm going to succumb to the disease. I have lupus, because we're not actually doing anything to correct, right, the underlying issue. We have the ability today to correct the underlying issue. Jude Samolsky has been my partner in this for over 25 years. He was the first to clone AV for therapeutic purposes, so really he's sort of the father of the field. We had the opportunity to reconnect with a little boy who was treated, Connor, in our Duchenne's muscular dystrophy trial. We developed a drug for this debilitating disease that affects young boys, and Pfizer has now taken in the clinic. And we saw this little boy who was treated 5 years ago. He should be in a wheelchair. That's historically what happens to children who have this disease. They go into a wheelchair, usually by the time they're 10, 11 years old. And by the time they're in their mid-20s, they usually succumb to the disease and pass away. He wasn't in a wheelchair. He's now 12 years of age, and he was able to walk, and he's running, and he's playing with his twin brother. We basically have been able to give him hope and a full childhood, and that, I think, is pretty priceless. So in some ways, I think when we talk about the cost of these transformative therapies, we miss the fact that, as Congressman Guthrie said, we're really changing the lives of these children and their families' lives and the communities in which they participate. And I think, there's economic benefits because now they're going to be productive citizens going forward. There's going to be less cost for their care, their medical care, but also, they need full-time caregivers. The parents can continue to be employed, so there's huge benefits. Plus, you look at things like hemophilia, where it costs almost $300,000 a year for people to get the therapies, the traditional therapies. With a one-time treatment, even though there is a big upfront cost, you avoid that for the rest of their life with better outcomes. And so I think I'm very happy that Brian has called this particular, a caucus today, so we can talk about some of these issues and together brainstorm about how to move these therapies forward faster for patients, but also try to figure out some cost-effective strategies to make sure that people get them, because at the end of the day, we save money. Over the long haul, it's actually cheaper to get these therapies to patients.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sheila. So I'm Peter Marks. So as Director of Center for Biologics, we have seen over the past several years kind of a growing critical mass of products in the either cell-based gene therapy or directly administered gene therapy space. We now have 17 approved products in this space, which is kind of gotten to critical mass. But what it's also shown us is that there is essentially a wave of other products waiting to make it across the finish line. Right now, we're kind of at a tender moment where there are any number of products where there's clinical data even that suggests that they may be effective, but because of the economics of the situation, and some of that economics has to do with our regulatory environment, which I'll speak more about in a moment, things are falling out of development. So it's a great interest to me to see what we can do to help move things along. And we're trying to use the levers that we have. Whether we'll be successful on all of them, I can't tell you, but I think Some of this has to do with improving the efficiency of manufacturing of the products. One of the things has to do with essentially increasing regulatory certainty in terms of the pathways for development. And part of that goes to using our accelerated approval provisions as fully as we can in this product space. That can actually help get things to market faster, that help patients, and it also helps companies stay in business. Another issue that's sometimes not well understood is that our global regulatory environment, where different countries have different requirements for filing gene therapies, has created kind of a disincentive for these very small populations, where it's just not worth it sometimes unless the population is large enough for a company to take the product and file it in Europe or in Japan, et cetera. And so we, again, are trying to work in that area to get to global regulatory convergence so that ideally one application could be accepted in multiple high-income countries, thereby bringing benefits to all of our countries at hopefully more quickly and at reduced cost. And then finally, we're trying to do what we can to help the ecosystem move more rapidly by getting the feedback that it needs in a more timely manner, because many small product developers, I joke, if you're a large company, 90 days to get through a cycle of feedback from FDA doesn't matter all that much. It's not great, but it's what we have as part of our meeting process. On the other hand, if you're a small company and that represents a quarter of your burn for a year, it's actually tends to be more problematic. So we're trying to address that as well. So hopefully by dealing with all of these things, we'll help prevent things from falling out of development and help more things get across the finish line, because there really are dozens of products that they're pretty close. And I think if we can just get the environment right for them, they'll get across the finish line. And some of these diseases are absolutely, they're terrible, they're heartbreaking, because they're parents who have a normal child that, in many of these diseases, that then withers away before their eyes. So anything we can do to help with those diseases and many others would be great.
Again, Eric Paulson. I'm chairman of the Institute for Gene Therapies. Brian, thanks for having all of us here today. And I'll talk a little bit about IGT as we reference it. But today is more than just Valentine's Day for us at IGT, because it's also the 4-year anniversary of when we began as an organization. So the panel is actually very fitting today. And it's exciting and almost a celebration for us, because it's also exciting to see all the therapies that have come online and approved by the FDA, helping many patients. So we've seen that as an organization now. And for those of you who don't know, so IGT is made up of expert stakeholders from across the healthcare system, including the gene therapy manufacturers, patient advocacy organizations, individual patient experts, scientists, researchers, et cetera. And together, our mission is advocating for a modernized policy and regulatory system that really isn't going to be encouraging innovation, that's going to be promoting patient access, and also is going to be codifying transparent reimbursement practices. And as was mentioned earlier by Sheila, gene therapies are potential one-time, durable, long-term cures, potentially with long-lasting benefits for patients and the healthcare system alike, both. And so they're giving patients now with genetic disorders and diseases new hope. Right now is a very exciting time for patients and for their families and for all of us who are here today. But we do need to make sure that there is a clear path forward for patients to actually access these therapies once they are approved. And so we also need to make sure more therapies are able to come to market. So we need to be thinking about how are they covered, how are they paid for, as Congressman Guthrie had mentioned, and we need to make sure we're considering the very unique value that these therapies promise, because we are spending about 85 cents of every healthcare dollar today managing the symptoms of chronic illnesses. And that's over a patient's lifetime. So gene therapies now give us an opportunity to disrupt this, to change that equation. And so if we can get that value equation right, we'll have more real and tangible impacts and opportunities to have benefits for patients in this game-changing field. So that's a top priority for us at IGT, is ensuring that decision makers or policy makers like Congressman Guthrie understand the true, incredibly unique value that these therapies offer. And so we believe that a one-size-fits-all value assessments are ineffective, they can be discriminatory, We should make sure we have assessments that are adaptive, that are reflecting available evidence for rare and ultra-rare diseases, and that determinations of value should also uphold the FDA's scientific authority over drug approvals. And importantly, that value is just one component in a very complex and comprehensive process in prioritizing coverage for a patient's medical needs and treatment options. So there's several ways that we can modernize the system to keep up with science, and I look forward to our discussion today.
Actually, so many questions. I mean, I have this list of questions here, but I have like a long list of other questions too. So I guess two things that come to mind. First, Congressman Guthrie, my team, many other people are concerned about the Medicaid drug rebate program and value-based contracting, right? Because if you have a gene therapy, as Sheila mentioned, it's a one-time treatment,
Right.
but the effects can last years. You don't want a one-time assessment and a one-time necessarily payment, because it's going to break the payers, right? You say, oh, we have a population, we can just pay $3 million right now. It's a better deal for the patient, most of all, that they get the treatment and we make sure that that treatment works over time and has durable effect that's meaningful to the patient. The Medicaid drug rebate program provides the best price for the Medicaid program, which is a good thing, right? Those who are poorer in society should have cheaper access to pharmaceutical products. The problem with the Medicaid drug rebate program and the best price is that in a value-based contract, that best price could be zero. So what do you think we should do, or what do you think are our alternatives to the Medicaid drug rebate program or ways to improve it?
Well, thanks for that. And so we're working on our value-based agreement bill now. Anna Eshoo and I are co-sponsored, so it's bipartisan. I actually thought nothing's really unanimous in the House anymore, but I thought it should have been close to unanimous moving forward. And there were people who opposed this provision, and their argument is it undermines the Medicaid rebate program. And so that assumes that state negotiators are going to negotiate a worse situation for themselves. And it's just a lack of trust in our state Medicaid programs. And the only reason that you would be against this, you say, well, is that drug companies are going to take advantage of state negotiators. And I just don't think the state negotiated governors who appoint, in Kentucky, the Medicaid commissioners and so forth, are going to allow them to be undermined. They're going to get the best price for moving forward and do the best deal. And so I think it's a false alarm to do that. I think we should move forward with value-based agreements. I mean, it had it was interesting. It was really strong support on the committee from members of the party opposite of mine that were from California who seemed to be around a lot of this moving forward. It seemed to be that was the votes that we had. And then when you brought up this deals with people having access to sickle cell treatments, I just couldn't quite grasp. And so the other side would argue that, well, there's a rule in place. Let's let this move forward. Why don't we have to codify this? It's premature. Well, we codify rules all the time. I mean, that was just kind of not a good argument in my view of moving forward. And so, but I know that Mark Wayne Mullen and it is bipartisan. There are people in the Senate moving forward, and so hopefully we can come together on it. But the Medicaid rebate program with all the stacking and so forth is a problem. But I think we just encourage or empower state negotiators to say this is in the best interest of our state, best interest of our citizens, and give them the opportunity to negotiate.
I agree. Having talked to several state Medicaid directors recently, they can definitely run circles around us. They're pretty sharp.
Well, they're not going to pay more than
Right,
they would otherwise. They're not going to be taking advantage of using
They have
that.
a state legislature, they have the governor, they have a population that they're maniacally focused on serving and getting good value for. So I have a lot of confidence in them.
Yeah.
Eric, you had mentioned a couple things that sort of caught my interest. One of them is that you were concerned about one-size-fits-all outcomes. I know that there's a recent cell and gene therapy access model where CMS is undertaking efforts to try and expand access, which is an admirable goal. Are you worried that setting a single set of outcomes could potentially or unintentionally limit access to products, and that any rebates on top of existing rebates might break the financing model for this space?
Well, it's a good question. First of all, you mentioned the model. So based on the conversations that we've been having at IGT with our members, I think the sickle cell community. And just remember, the model right now only applies to sickle cell, right? So they're cautiously optimistic about it. The model's voluntary. So if CMS is working on behalf of states and asks for rebates or discounts that they're not workable, the manufacturers do have the opportunity to step away, to step back, and just go to the traditional way of negotiating, doing supplemental rebate agreements or multiple best price, for instance. So those options are going to be there regardless of the model. In terms of the discounts themselves and financing, this is one of the key points about value-based arrangements and agreements that Congressman Guthrie had mentioned as a part of his bill, for instance. Right now, there's broad recognition about the value that is being offered, or that the pricing that's being offered is very unique in terms of the value of these therapies. So the diseases that are there that the FDA has made approvals for in these therapies are very expensive. I mean, Sheila had mentioned hemophilia, for instance, so very costly. So the value for gene therapy is very apparent. The question is, how do you make sure we're allowing this to work itself into a budget, right? How flexibility is really going to be the key there. So our members feel that one really important tool in the toolbox is making sure that states have the ability for flexible arrangements. Flexibility is really going to be key there, and that's flexible arrangements between both the state and the manufacturer. So that's why we've been strong supporters of Congressman Guthrie's bill and the MVP Act. We do believe there should be additional voluntary financing tools for both states and manufacturers to help realize that value. I'm sure there's going to be some technical questions and concerns as the model goes forward. There's no doubt about that, but it is important to remember that the model isn't going to also necessarily work for every disease, right? And so we'll have to kind of wait and see how that goes forward. So I think, frankly, at IGT, what we want to make sure that we see right now with CMS is that they're engaging with states on issues going forward on multiple best price, for instance, that there's a little bit of hand-holding, there's a little bit more information providing, opening portals, guidance, et cetera, and we'll see what happens.
And I think the two themes I took away from that are, one is flexibility in terms of measuring outcomes and how you measure outcomes, when you measure outcomes, modifying that going forwards as we continue to learn, because it's a very new space.
Can I add to what he just said?
Yeah, of course.
So just talk about like the price going down to zero you were talking about. So people need to understand that the manufacturer of the drug has stake in this. So if you look at, and I always want to emphasize, this helps patients their lives, changes their lives. But if you look at it just from financial side of it, you are putting a lot of money in up front on the bet that, or on the understanding that you're going to save money over time. So if you don't save money over time, in our arrangement, the manufacturer has some responsibility in that. And that's why you say it could drive the price. So if it does nothing, the state pays nothing for it. So therefore, the Medicaid best price is zero. But the reason that's the case is because the manufacturer has stake in the game, not just the taxpayer. I want to make sure people understand that.
Right, and so that way that the manufacturer's interests are aligned with those of the patient and those of the state Medicaid program.
If it doesn't work, they don't get paid for it.
Exactly, and if it does work and it works well, they get paid well.
They get paid well, and somebody has a better life.
Exactly.
Which is really interesting, because you look at other therapeutic areas or other types of drugs, right? They don't have that kind of risk sharing. Mm-hmm. They just get paid. And so in many ways, there's more of a burden on gene therapy manufacturers than there would be on small molecule manufacturers.
And I was going to say, in this way, actually, gene therapies are, I would call, the very definition of value-based contracting and innovation, because you're paying for the performance. Peter, I have a FDA question, something I've always been wondering about. I live in academia, I admit, but I try and make sure I come out into the real world. And accelerated approval is a massive controversy in academia. Now, I was also a reviewer at Cedars, so I have a more nuanced perspective, right? Because accelerated approval is you're just redistributing the pre- and post-market evidentiary burden, because you're saying there's a population that has an unmet need and they don't have an alternative. So their alternative could be further decline in their disease or decline in their health. The alternative, which I don't think a lot of people even realize, could be death, right? So when you have an unmet need, that unmet need is real. There's a lot of controversy from the academic and policy community about the use of accelerated approval, and a lot of assertions that products from accelerated approval don't work, and it's not the same evidentiary standard. Yet their own evidence, because I've gone through and read all the papers, suggests that most confirmatory trials are done. Sometimes they're a little on the slower side, right? Because it's not easy to run a clinical trial and it's hard to recruit patients. Do you view accelerated approval as the same evidence-based review and approval pathway as other FDA review pathways? And if our critics were sitting here next to us, what would you tell them?
So, I view accelerated approval as really critical for helping patients in a timely manner. I think to ignore the ability to get something to a child who's got a degenerative neurologic disease, where getting something to them 1 or 2 years sooner will make the difference between whether they can function in society or whether society needs to care for them for the rest of their lives. So there's an urgency there, and I think the accelerated approval provisions allow us to meet an effectiveness standard. They allow us to actually do what we do best at FDA, which is use the totality of the evidence we have, which sometimes is the scientific evidence combined with the clinical evidence that we have, to put together an approval which, by and large, 95+% of the time are confirmed out subsequently. And I would say to you, it's an extremely good pathway. It's one where, by the way, we have this pathway called accelerated approval. If 100% of the time it confirmed out, we wouldn't need an accelerated approval pathway, because heck, whatever we were doing, we'd be doing it perfectly, right? So I think it's okay that we might make a mistake every once in a while, and that mistake may be that it's not confirmed out because the product doesn't work. Alternatively, sometimes it's just the trial design is not proper to actually measure an effect that really is there. So different reasons why that could happen, but I would say it's critical for us, particularly in this area of gene therapies, where there's often a tremendous amount of science. We can measure markers that are changing, the very objective measures. It's not, it's not loosey-goosey. It's specific scientific measures, and we can see something's working. It makes sense that it works, because if you've got a gene that's missing and you give it back, and then you see someone having a response with changes in either a biomarker or in some clinical endpoint, it's very strong evidence. So I think that's what I would say in this space. To the critics who would say, well, why can't you just wait for the clinical evidence of how someone feels, functions, and survives, so that you can actually be done with it that way? Well, the answer is, when we have, for some products like the chimeric antigen receptor T cells, CAR T cells for hematologic malignancies, we didn't give them accelerated approvals. The data after 6 months were so dispositive that they could get full approvals. But for these smaller populations, we do need to be able to use accelerated approval. And those who get angry because they say, well, look at this large population in cancer who you gave an accelerated approval to, they didn't really need that. I'd say that, look, this is a provision that potentially brings benefit to people's lives more rapidly. And as long as we follow through on it, we should be in good shape. And I think I have to thank Congress, because in last year we got more authority to make it easier to take things off the market when they don't meet their accelerated approval provisions. And stay tuned for more on that coming in the coming weeks.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, because accelerated approval allows the agency to take some regulatory risk in a good and constructive way, right? Because if you can look at it, and this is the question of looking at it at the population level, like the entire US population, saying, I'm worried about US health spending, I'm worried about people using drugs that may be less effective. But when you look at it from the people who suffer from that disease and the fact that they have limited or no options, it's better to make an error and approve something that you might have a negative confirmatory trial, and then 95% of the time make the decision where you've allowed early market access to a drug that is safe and effective when the patient has no alternative option.
Brian, I would argue that it's also, when you think about the public health risk,
Right.
when you're dealing with these small populations, you're not putting a tremendous number of people at risk. And if the chance is you're going to bring benefit here, and you have a good scientific rationale, it seems very cruel in some cases to the parents
I
to
wholeheartedly agree with you, and that's
Talk about us
yeah.
giving the accelerated approval. I mean, the best lobbyists, and you talk about lobbyists in America, the best lobbyists in the world are people from our districts who show up at our doors and talk to us. That's what you would expect. Your constituents are make the biggest impact. Have a family, has a son with Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, and they come to me very early when I was here and said, you know, I guess at that time the therapies really didn't replace what you've lost, but it prevents loss going forward. So they were on a timeline or a fight to beat his kid, what you talked about, being in a wheelchair. Yeah. He goes, this is if I can get access to this now, this is the difference in my kid walking and moving forward. And I'm a statistics person, so I understand the golden standard of a clinical trial is you have the placebo, and so talk about doing placebos and in a population like this. And then the other thing is, when you're designing therapies for that individual person with cell, you really can't have a control population because you're not going to design a therapy for somebody that doesn't work. It's not like taking you're measuring a chemical pill. You're actually measuring a specifically designed therapy for that person's genetics. And so we want to make sure that we work with you guys to have that, and have appreciated the FDA moving forward on it with some criticism. It's mostly from think tanks that bring up the criticism, not the parents. And you don't want parents to have false hope either. No. But you also, if there is hope, you want them to have it.
I mean,
yeah, just to reemphasize one point, I mean, you're really racing against the clock, because the longer that you wait, the more progressed the disease is, and the less likely we can do anything beneficial for that patient. It's very rare that we can reverse all the damage, but we can stop the progression. And so that's why we really need to get access to these drugs, right? Get the drugs to patients as quickly as possible. Yeah.
I think that the other thing that accelerated approval brings up to me is why we have to be so careful about every decision that we make at FDA, because there were probably over the course of at least the past decade or so, even a little bit before then, there were occasional accelerated approvals that were probably done rather than just because something didn't quite have enough evidence, perhaps. That might not be the best reason to do an accelerated approval. I think we need to still meet our evidentiary standards, and I think that's where we get some criticism, is when we've kind of not done that. So, and I think it's easy enough with the science behind gene therapy to meet our evidentiary standards. So I don't think that's really an issue here.
Yeah, and as I said, I'm a strong supporter and wholeheartedly agree with the agency using this authority with more flexibility. And I say, as I said, I disagree with a lot of my policy colleagues on this because they look at it at the population level, and I say, what about the population of people with the disease? Mm-hmm. And then I think the other thing people forget, and I recognize this as a physician, diseases affect individuals. So yeah, there's a number, 10,000 people, 1,000 people who have a disease, but the disease is the individual. And if that individual doesn't have access to a product, they might not be with us. And I can say that because both my parents have passed away from diseases for which they had very few or no treatments. My father died of brain cancer at 58, and my mother died of Alzheimer's at age 70 during the pandemic. And my mother had no treatment options, and my father had very few. So I'm acutely aware that in addition to regulatory flexibilities, that us supporting product innovation, it doesn't just help the population, it doesn't just allow people to be productive, but if they had had access to treatments that were available now, I might actually have my parents. And that having other people not have to go through those experiences, be it with their children, with their parents, whomever, their friends, whomever it is, that is what gene therapy and cell therapy offer us. Sheila, I wanted to talk with you about manufacturing, because that's something that we have nerded out on many times. Many of my colleagues think, and there's a lot of discussion about onshoring and nearshoring, it's very hard. Right. What are your thoughts about onshoring and nearshoring? Do you think it's realistic? Yeah. Is this a magical pipe dream, which we're sitting around and discussing? Are there policies and things that we could be doing or should be supporting?
Yeah, so first just to talk about the whole topic of manufacturing. I think you would probably agree. It's the biggest obstacle to making sure we can make gene therapies more broadly, and cell therapies more broadly accessible. It's a very time-consuming process, and it's relatively expensive in comparison, of course, to pills like small molecules or other biologics like monoclonal antibodies. Largely, that's because I think we're still an evolving field. We're still at the very beginning stages of this technology, and it's advancing very quickly. It's very difficult to keep abreast of all the changes that are occurring, but they're exciting changes. We're making these drugs safer, and we're expanding the number of diseases that we can treat, and we're seeing now the applicability of things that we did in these rare diseases. We're now applying it to pathway diseases like heart failure and Parkinson's, and hopefully soon Alzheimer's. And so the potential is great, but we're still in the early days of doing this. I mean, we all remember when computers were evolving, right? In the beginning stages, I still remember I had to carry around, a laptop. It was a compact, and it wasn't compact, it was pretty big. And now we have these very light, supercomputing machines and a laptop. And so it's going to take time. And the field's doing a lot of great things. I know, in my own enterprises, we're always constantly trying to get our yields up, trying to get our quality improved. And so the field is very eager to do this because we want to drive down all the costs and make these drugs more accessible. And I actually want to talk about one of the ways, right? We're always innovating, because I think, again, it's science and it's innovation and improvements. We have tweaked a lot of things, I guess, in our manufacturing process, and then sometimes we have these enormous breakthroughs. And one breakthrough that I'm pretty excited about is thin film technology. We wanted to make sure, I have a foundation, Jude and I established Columbus Children's Foundation to bring gene therapies for ultra-rare indications to patients at no cost. And we have been aiding in the development and treatment of juvenile Parkinson's, amino acid decarboxylase deficiency, which is quite a mouthful, so I call it juvenile Parkinson's, and assisted in the treatment of over 50 kids free of charge with transformative results. Literally, before treatment, they can't even turn over, right, without assistance. After treatment, a year after treatment, they're going to school, they're walking, they're talking, they're playing baseball. I get pictures all the time of these kids doing amazing things after treatment, truly transformative, like miracle, almost level of transformation. But an ultra-rare indication, you can't develop it in a for-profit commercial structure, so we developed Columbus Children's Foundation. Free of charge is a big hurdle, because that means that people just of their philanthropy are subsidizing the treatment of these kids. It's not overwhelming. It's about $70,000 per patient, but still, when you have 50-some kids, that's a pretty big number. And so we came up with a technology where we can store the gene therapies and vaccines, by the way, in this thin film, and it preserves the structure and allows us to store it without cold chain requirements. And so that's one more way that we can drive down costs, because we avoid cold chain requirements, and we can stabilize these gene therapies for long periods of time. That means we do one big production run, and then we have it for the next 10, 20 years, right, as new incidence comes up, and we don't have to keep manufacturing. Manufacturing usually costs for this indication between $3 to $5 million. So we drive that cost down substantially. So again, it's just another example about how the field is committed to innovating and keep, driving down these costs. When it comes to, onshoring versus offshoring, I think we want to go wherever the costs are the lowest. I know there's always a lot of concerns. If you go to places like China, will they steal your IP? I don't know. We don't manufacture in China. In my last company, I couldn't get resources to build manufacturing here in the US. I think we were just a little bit too early. There was a lot of money that came into the sector after I had to figure out how to manufacture. We manufacture in Spain. We were able to get subsidies from the Spanish and Basque governments, and so we build our manufacturing operations in Spain. There's a huge relative cost advantage, especially when comparing the cost of labor in Boston to Spain. It's much cheaper. And so we are able to drive down the cost, and especially for these ultra-rare indications, it's more affordable. So I would say, I think we want to be open to going wherever we can, either because of cost, and sometimes there's capacity constraints. For a long time, people were in a queue, right? They couldn't get their drug manufactured for 24, 36 months. That's eased up a little bit, but again, there's all these drugs that are advancing very quickly, and it's most likely that, again, we're going to see that constraint on manufacturing. So for me, right, meeting lots of parents who are very desperate to get their kids treated, I'm always trying to figure out how do I get the manufacturing done as quickly as possible, knowing that I have a long lead time and knowing I want to drive down the cost as much as possible. So I hope, right, that policy will continue to allow us to source it offshore and bring it back into the US, because I just think we need that additional capacity.
So lucky for us, we have people who are highly involved in policy here with us on stage. Congressman Guthrie, I'm really worried about the growth of the Chinese biopharmaceutical industry, and I want the US to maintain its innovation and creativity dominance in this space. I don't want us to become subject to having all of our products manufactured in China with the rising geopolitical tensions. I also know that manufacturing is tough, right?
Right.
Like, and you know this, like it's hard. There are tax issues, there are labor and training and education issues, there are infrastructure issues, there are zoning issues, there are environmental regulation issues. There's the list of issues for building a manufacturing plant in the US. It's hard. Like I couldn't fit it on the iPad probably if I tried.
Yeah.
Knowing that there's a wide range of options, what do you think we should be doing to encouraging the development of biomedical research and manufacturing in the US?
We do a really good job of the research. We absolutely have to figure out how we manufacture more here. And it can't just, we need to have it all within the United States or within friendly countries. I mean, it's not going to, can't be 100% here. And so my background is manufacturing automotive supply. So the automotive supply chains are worldwide and they're difficult. When people snapped their fingers and said, let's move it all back to America out of China, because the problem with doing it with China is that you can't depend on them. In times of crisis, is China going to say this is all for us and none for y'all in times of crisis, as we sort of saw with COVID? And so you can't have your base manufacturing that's so important in countries that you can't depend on. And so just to do it only in the United States probably isn't realistic, but how do you do it with friendly countries? And I will tell you, supply chains develop kind of organically over time. And all of a sudden somebody figures out I can manufacture cheaper here. In the automotive world, I can tell you, people start moving there. Well, it didn't work, so let's move it back to the United States because we didn't get the quality we wanted. So it comes back, and then so some of the lower quality, the necessary products are done overseas, and the high quality stuff's done here in the United States. And so I think that's probably, I'm sure, how the biomedical manufacturing has happened. The problem is you can't just snap your fingers and bring that all back. And so what's the right? So we're working on ways and means. What are the trade? What are the tax? And it's extremely expensive to manufacture in the bio world. And just like amoxicillin, some people came to me and they're concerned about having supply of amoxicillin. It's at least $1 billion to build a plant to manufacture amoxicillin that has an extremely low margin. And so then we have to ask ourselves, the United States going to get into like we did with the chips, and just all of a sudden we're going to start subsidizing all these businesses to come back, and you have industrial policy, and that has a lot of its own implications. So we're still sorting through it. I guess to give you an answer, there are all of these different things, and we're still sorting through what's the right mix to make sure that we have the key ingredients that is under control of our people that live in our country or our citizens or people that are friendly to us. And we're trying to figure that out.
100% agree with you. We do need a global pharmaceutical supply chain. The idea of us bringing all pharmaceutical manufacturing back to the U.S. is absurd. It's not going to happen, right? You cannot
do it without massive subsidies, and the massive subsidies don't always give the most efficient, best way to make.
But the idea that we probably do need some API or active pharmaceutical ingredient manufacturing in friendly countries, maybe some fill finish domestically as a start, right?
Right.
Like
And-
we have to start with the technical labor base that we have, recognizing the many barriers that exist to building a plant plus the high costs. It's probably not realistic
Yeah, and we
for
all want
us.
to do the policy. We're all focused on what is the right policy. That's what we're trying to address. And then the second, it's been difficult to get a lot done in the House this year. And so and once we come up with what the right policy should be, how do you manufacture that into, how do you get that into law so that people can move forward? And that's, we're dedicated to it, just trying to figure out what's the right process. I think we have to get that right first.
I agree. I actually, Peter, I had a question for you also about manufacturing. I don't, as we talked about, we're probably not going to be, we need to ensure a viable global pharmaceutical supply chain. We also need to be aware of our geopolitical adversaries. We also aren't going to, as I said, move manufacturing all onshore, and we're also not going to nearshore all of it. That's not realistic. Some of that will move with time, but it takes years, it takes decades, it takes policy, it takes training and labor and building a technical base. The one thing I think that people also aren't aware of in the gene therapy space is that manufacturing is different for gene therapies than for other biologic products. Could you talk a moment about what manufacturing for a gene therapy product looks like, how that's different, and what the challenges are?
Yes. So gene therapies right now, so things are in a little bit of an evolution, but as they are now, it's a really complex process. This isn't like you put a bunch of chemicals together and do some purification steps, and out the other end comes a little drug that you can put in a bottle. Here, you often have to start with a cell line that you infect with a virus, then you purify the virus that comes after doing all your genetic manipulation, purify that virus, formulate it, and you have to do things very correctly to get the right parameters so that you have the most effective product. Requires a fair amount of tweaking. Currently, a lot of it's done in many places by hand. For reasons that somewhat escape me, but don't totally escape me, we haven't moved to automation in this area quite the way we might have, but we're working on that. And so it's a very labor-intensive process, especially for small batches where it's often being done still in very small batches compared to how one would make large pharmaceutical products. So complicated manufacturing, and I think you're right. The cost it's not exorbitant, but it's compared to a pill, it's just a different order of magnitude. So I think we need to try to find efficiencies. Hopefully, there's more and more interest now into, at least for part of the processes, such as the purification steps, trying to automate them to try to reduce cost. That would potentially be helpful. Might also help with getting things, for some of these things, onshoring, because by necessity will occur because there aren't large populations and they're being produced in the US. It's a really important, I mean, having dealt with the vaccine nightmare during the pandemic, we do have to, I think very carefully about what capacity we have. This is whether it's gene therapies or in the larger industry, what we have actually onshore so that we don't get caught flat-footed in the event of another pandemic or event, either natural or man-made. And some of that, to me, is something that Janet Woodcock has advocated for many years, which is moving more towards advanced manufacturing. And we have a pilot that we're working with a consortium of universities, including it's run out of MIT, towards advanced manufacturing, essentially continuous manufacturing of mRNA vaccines. The idea being that if you can shrink the whole enterprise, put it into a small footprint and have it work essentially on an ongoing basis 24 hours a day, you have a small package run by a few highly skilled people that may be helpful because the cost benefit there in the event of another pandemic or event is positive. So we'll see. But I think some of this goes to automation It's a good use of AI too, because artificial intelligence can be used to analyze a lot of the controls and do continuous process improvement when you're working that way. And I'd rather have my AI fixing continuous processes than writing plays or doing art.
I mean, maybe AI could help me write some of my policy papers. The question is would it have better ideas? Hopefully not. I like the idea of advanced manufacturing and also automation to increase the efficiency and lower the costs. That could potentially allow us to have manufacturing in more friendly countries, ensuring that we have a robust global pharmaceutical supply chain that is distributed throughout the world, but that we have access to, and that our enemies cannot necessarily use to choke us.
Yeah, Frank Pallone and I had a bill last year that passed, and it's in law, that is trying to make this, help move this forward from a policy perspective. So.
I actually had a question for you. So the NIST released a proposal on march-in rights for intellectual property, and everyone has had a variety of comments on it. And I read this proposal recently, and I was really concerned because it was basically saying that price is a potential, it's advocating for price as a potential justification for the government taking of private property or intellectual property. Drug pricing is a morass. There are lots of things we can do. There are lots of other policy levers. My concern, my personal concern, many people share this concern about march-in rights, is that this could break that academic bench to bedside commercialization model that we have in the pharmaceutical industry that has produced hundreds, if not thousands, of products that have made their way into the prescription pad, or now it's electronic, right? Because we have electronic health records, but it's made it so that I have products that I can prescribe to patients. Patients can do things like with heart failure, they have goal-directed medical therapy. They take 5 or 6 products, and they can walk upstairs, they can go to the grocery store, they can go to work. Are you worried that the march-in rights proposal is going to break this commercialization model?
Absolutely. Anytime your intellectual property is at risk, you can talk more about how you get people to invest moving forward. And you do have situations that appear, like the EpiPen situation a few years ago, or if you had an outbreak of Ebola and the company making it says, well, I'm not going to give you this prescription unless you pay this exorbitant prices. So, I mean, that's what that's for, is just unique moments in history, not just to control the way that people price their products. And if you can't feel you can get it, well, you need more competition in the marketplace, but just being able to take somebody's intellectual property, I guess you probably should know, how would you get investment in, this stuff just doesn't happen. You couldn't get investment to move these forward.
Yeah, I mean, I read the policy and I was like, well, it seemed very Soviet to me. I felt like there was a little bit of time travel when I read it. And
what happened to the Soviet Union did not innovate.
Right.
Yeah, that was originally crumbled. Yeah, they were not innovative. They were not an innovative society. There was no incentive to do so.
But Brian, using that as a tool to lower costs is not the right approach, right?
Agreed.
Because
And
that's
so what
the
are
problem.
so what are states doing to lower costs so far? Has anyone had any thoughts about what state Medicaid program models have used to lower costs for products?
Yeah, well, this is one of the questions that we have about the model that's been proposed, for instance, right? So I think we have to remember, again, the model is just for sickle cell, and we just got those therapies, some of those products approved recently. So I'm not even aware of any agreements that have been put in place between states and the manufacturers on that side, because these arrangements can take a long time to put together. They're often very complex. But that being said, CMS does need to consider, or they will be considering, I assume, adding new disease states to the model. And if they do, that's going to be a sticking point, because it's critical that we maintain more of an incentive for different types of flexible agreements between states and manufacturers. And if you force states to take, nationally negotiated rates, for instance, that's going to kind of run counter to that. It's going to be a disincentive for states to have flexible agreements and arrangements with individual manufacturers for their patients.
Right, because that would promote flexibility and competition on price, and also non-price features. Peter, I saw a Stat News article recently about a Spanish hospital obtaining regulatory approval to manufacture CAR T-cell therapy on site. And I was that was surprising to me. It's a very hard process to make CAR T-cell therapy. Do you think that do you see this as regulatory erosion?
No, I don't see it as regulatory erosion. The Europeans seem to have an idea that the Europeans have always had what's called a hospital exception, where a hospital can manufacture a product for use at that hospital, and they kind of are a little bit loosey-goosey, and often it's in that country to treat a given disease without actually regulatory oversight or much regulatory oversight. And so that has been put in place. France uses it, the Netherlands use it, and now Spain is using it. And they are quite happy with this because they've been able to reduce cost. But however, when you look at what they're doing, the company that's making these doesn't make the vector. They don't make the gene therapy vector that they use on the cells. They make the cells themselves. So I think it's a limited circumstance that works for them. I don't view this, though, as a solution. This hospital exception works for them in Europe because of their payment system and because of the niche products that are being made. But I don't think it represents what we need to actually get to literally hundreds or thousands of rare diseases. There, I think we need a robust commercial model that ultimately, if I had a crystal ball for the future, it's that 10 or 15 years from now, we're going to have companies that will have a portfolio of maybe even 50 or 100 gene therapies, perhaps, or ways to manufacture them that will help keep a robust commercial enterprise rather than a bunch of individual institutions doing this. I worry, having been in an academic institution, I worry the dean changes and you worry that, okay, we're not going to make this gene therapy anymore. Whereas that's not going to happen in the commercial world, you have an asset that has value, that actually has intellectual property. It's not going to go away the same way. So I hopefully, it works for them. I think it's very nice that it's working for them. They're actually looking to export that model outside of Spain, making their product using a company. So that just goes back to it saying that maybe this isn't the most robust way to do it.
Thank you. I have some questions from the audience, but I also understand that you have a hearing you have to go to, so I just wanted to say thank you. We'll let you escape.
Okay.
But thank you for joining us.
Thanks a lot. Thank you guys for doing it. Yeah, I appreciate it. Oops, appreciate it. Thanks.
So, taking questions from the audience, and I already have had several that have been texted. This one I think is best for Peter and Sheila. Thinking about if you're a product manufacturer, product developer, and also if you're a patient, right? Like global regulatory harmonization is important because it reduces the regulatory burden for the product developer to get to market. And that's important for patients, right? Because if you're a patient with a rare disease, you frequently don't have many options, if you have any option. Can you tell us more about what possible global collaborations there are to align regulatory approvals in this space? And sort of, if you can say, Peter, what do those discussions look like, or what should they look like? And Sheila, for you, how would that affect how you think about product development?
So right now we're trying to make some headway in this area by at least starting small, by working with EMA and a few of the other original ICH members like Swissmedic, Health Canada, MHRA, which was part of the European Union before, and the Japanese Regulatory Authority, PDMA, to put together a pilot program where we jointly review a few cases of gene therapy at the same time The idea being, hopefully with the same data set and reviewing them together, we'll do it more efficiently on the same file, and hopefully then come to some conclusions about how we could have regulatory efficiency, so that I think the idea being that if a small company knew they could submit their gene therapy to essentially once and it would essentially count for multiple countries, so that at the end of the day they get an approval, not just in the United States, but in 5 or 6 high-income countries, that could make the difference between non-commercial viability and commercial viability. It doesn't take, you don't have to be, I don't have an MBA, but you can do a net present value calculation and show pretty quickly that that going from a potential population in 330 million to one of 1 billion gives you, can take you over the edge 3 times the size of a population.
Yeah, having that kind of global access too is going to speed up drug development, because we now have a bigger pool of patients that we can draw from. One of the biggest sort of time-consuming aspects of drug development is finding the patients, enrolling them. It's just a lot of paperwork, a lot of wasted time, right? So streamlining that through global access would be incredible.
So if there are questions from the audience, feel free. Jack will roam with the microphone. I have a few that have been texted to me. Eric, I had a question that I got. It says, what challenges do you see with payer coverage in trying to reach the full extent of the FDA product label? I can see the managed care companies nervously sweating somewhere right now.
Well, I mean, right now, in the environment we have, we see payers out there that are trying to restrict coverage, to clinical trials, for instance, in those populations. We see restrictions, coverage based on whether the therapies earned accelerated approval, which we mentioned, or just the traditional approval. We saw it happen in a Duchenne gene therapy product that was in label that was denied, where a payer denied coverage, even in the appeals process. So our focus at IGT is making sure that payers are doing their jobs, right? Staying in their lane, assessing value, assessing access, and not second-guessing the safety and the efficacy that the FDA. That's up to the scientists and the research and the experts at the FDA and Dr. Marks. And so that's their job. I think their best decision, they are best aligned to make those decisions. Who should get those products, who shouldn't get those products, based on clinical evidence, and then evaluate them. So that process is very thorough, it's very rigorous, and it should be respected.
Right, the FDA is probably the best scientific arbiter of evidentiary basis for medical products.
It's the gold standard, right? Yeah.
So I have another question, and this will probably require some audience explanation, so apologies in advance, Peter. It says, there are novel cell and tissue implants that are clearly not drugs or biologics. Wouldn't it be best to regulate these under existing authority under Section 361, rather than divert scarce FDA resources by treating these biologics as biologics regulated under Section 351? And that says, it appears that FDA may be up-regulating cell products as biologicals. Now, the fun part for both of us is this just shows us how nerdy FDA product regulation is.
Right. So very quickly, there are classes of products that FDA does not regulate with pre-market authorization in the cell and tissue therapy space. There are things like skin grafts, bone grafts, where as long as people follow regulations to make sure that they don't transmit infectious diseases, basically they register and list, and we take the safety and efficacy as given. There are then our traditional biologic products where you have to submit a biologics license application after studying the product under an investigation new drug application. And then there are some products where they kind of fit in this never land. They are perhaps tissues that might have something done to them, like perhaps being seated on a scaffold, or being used in a way that's different in the recipient than they were in the donor, which triggers some regulatory need to potentially move to a higher level of regulatory oversight. So there's this class of products in the middle that we don't have something that's exactly right for. And we are working on trying to figure out something in the middle. We can't say too much more about it right now because we're working on it, but we understand. I think the person who's asking this question is asking, what about these products that the concept of submitting a full-fledged BLA with the cost associated with it and the complexity for what is really just kind of a tissue on steroids, it's a little joke there, which some of these are, is combined with something else, is probably a little bit of overkill, and we understand that. We're looking into how we can find kind of a middle way forward that meets the tremendous amount of, I mean, there's a tremendous amount of innovation in this area, and we don't want to stifle that.
I was going to say that is probably the nerdiest question I have ever had.
You have a question in the audience there.
Yeah.
Maybe they're less nerdy.
I don't think I'm going to surpass that level of nerdiness, unfortunately. But I think this is a question probably for Dr. Peter Marks. So regarding regulatory harmonization, I think my vague understanding is sometimes the FDA prefers to see clinical trials done in the U.S. for some new medications because of worries about standard of care in the U.S. versus other countries. How does that work with this attempt at regulatory harmonization?
It's a great question. And the gene therapy and on this kind of rare disease space, as long as the trials have been conducted in a manner that we consider reasonable, and that the data has been collected in a way that we can audit, that it's been done with good clinical practices, that people have given informed consent, they followed the Declaration of Helsinki. In other words, they've done things that we would, it doesn't matter where it's been conducted. I know that there's been some discussion in the oncology world about having concerns about if a trial was just conducted, for instance, in China or something. In this rare disease space, we can't be picky about it. And as long as we're comfortable that we can audit the data and that they meet our standards, we'll take them from wherever they come.
So selfishly, I have a question. This could be for Sheila and or Eric. Drugs are expensive, right? Like we all know drugs are expensive. Drug pricing is its own challenge. The other challenge is if you have a rare disease, you're not just going down the street to your primary care doctor for treatment, right? Like we can't, go 5 minutes over to One Medical to get care for a rare disease that only 10,000 other people have. It's just, you have to go to a quaternary care center, maybe a tertiary care center. That involves a lot of travel and a lot of burden. So your primary care doctor ends up being a highly specialized physician who might be a plane flight away. A lot of patients who have rare diseases have incurred thousands upon thousands of medical expenses, travel expenses. Their families may have spent hundreds of thousands of dollars. So the people who have rare diseases, in addition to having the rare disease, also have an enormous financial burden simply from being sick. Do you think that we should address anti-kickback safe harbors for travel and ancillary services in order to ensure that patients can actually get to the doctor to get therapy?
I mean, I'll make a comment. Absolutely. I think IGT believes strongly that those anti-kickback statutes should have a safe harbor for providing those types of services. There's legislation on the Hill, for instance, that would do that. And if manufacturers are going to help cover reimbursement for travel, for lodging, for meals, for fertility protection, there could be a wide host of issues, right, that can be covered that can be expensive. And keep in mind also, and right now this is very important for the sickle cell community, for instance, where the model is going forward for CMS, but that doesn't start for another year. And there may be states right now that have centers of excellence in certain areas. So patients need to travel to those states. So it's really important for CMS to be engaging with other states and their Medicaid directors to let them know, to go through an earlier certification process, whatever it may be, to make sure that this process can flow for patients to actually be able to accommodate them and then combine that with anti-kickback statutes.
Even if the drug prices and there's value-based contracting and a product is affordable, safe, and effective, maybe got to market early through accelerated approval, if you can't afford to actually travel there to get the treatment and see the doctor.
Right.
It's sort of a non-issue, right? Like you don't have access.
Absolutely.
But I think there's a bigger question. How do we take off some of the burden from patients? And also the diagnosis, right? A lot of parents spend over a decade going from doctor to doctor to try to figure out why their child isn't normal, right? What's wrong with them? And it seems to me that if they had more access to genetic testing, it's sort of like we have the answers to the exam. Why are we prohibiting people from getting access to this type of testing that can more quickly direct them towards the solution, right? Identify the cause of the disease. I think there's a lot of things that we can do as a society to help parents and patients get, more ready access to the treatments, including earlier diagnosis.
And that goes into the importance of newborn screening, for instance. Yeah.
Other questions from the audience?
I was actually just about to bring up newborn screening, so glad it came up organically. But I was just wondering, do you think that there's a bigger role the FDA can play in sort of doing horizon scanning and helping the newborn screening process adapt more quickly to all the upcoming cell and gene therapies that are going to be coming out? Because right now they can only review 2 conditions a year, and it's a very long process, and then it's another 6 years before states are even screening for it.
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think we've been having conversations with NIH about, I think that there's a desire, and NIH has had some initiative in this area of trying to revisit how we look at newborn screening, because if you look at what they're doing in the UK now, that's, they're looking to really try to figure out early on what could be there, and it has been a real challenge, especially because things have to also diffuse through all the different states, and that also takes time. So more to come, but it's recognized as a problem.
I have a question about, I think in the spirit of increasing access to patients, this idea around manufacturing at multiple sites, especially for cell therapies. And, Sheila, I think you talked about eliminating the supply chain, right? So I think there's, all sorts of challenges in manufacturing at different sites. Can I ask what the agency and what developers and manufacturers are doing to potentially enable that model, assuming that there's a business case for manufacturing at different sites, and if we even expand that to multiple countries, what are the efforts that are ongoing right now?
It's actually Scott Gottlieb and I actually wrote, there's a piece in the New England Journal from 2017 where we envision this as a very reasonable way to go. And it's a matter of just having the quality control systems in place and deciding whether you're going to have one license holder that has a bunch of sites that they oversee, or individual license holders that manufacturing according to a common protocol. But we see this as very viable as long as all of the quality standards are met. It may be increasingly viable. There's a couple of companies now in the cell therapy space that have come up with what are practically automatically functioning units. They need a human to interface with them slightly to put the product in to start and to take out the manufactured product. And it may turn out that allows this model to work in certain instances. It may not work across every gene therapy, but even if it can work across some of the cell therapies, CAR T cells, it could be a game changer in terms of reducing cost and making access simpler.
Yeah, one idea I think that you have touched on before in a lot of your presentations is risk-adjusted CMC applications, right? So I can see having a commercial scale manufacturing plant for things that are larger, patient population, have an approval. But it would be great if you could have smaller sort of supplementary manufacturing for these smaller indications where maybe the CMC requirements are not as robust. And these would be diseases where there's small patient populations, a big unmet need, very devastating, outcomes for patients if they don't get treated, and have more nimble, smaller scale 50-liter bioreactors maybe for these applications. And I think that could expedite access for these smaller, ultra-rare indications, and could take the burden off of the bigger manufacturing facilities to focus on the bigger commercial applications. It'd be great to be able to create a hybrid manufacturing system like that, each with different sort of patient target, disease focus, and sort of size. Anyway, I think that there's lots of opportunities, but the FDA has mentioned before that it is willing to pursue risk-adjusted CMC requirements based on things like disease severity, known manufacturing techniques, and if it's a big unmet medical need.
Well, I think we're about time. I know people have meetings and such to go to. I've really enjoyed this discussion. I appreciate you all joining us, talking about everything from the Medicaid drug rebate program to the need for a robust global biopharmaceutical supply chain, to FDA regulatory issues, to probably the most wonkiest question I've ever asked anybody. Thank you all for joining and for traveling, and for our viewers online, happy Valentine's Day.